If you drive through Santa Clarita now, it's a basic, bedroom suburban community with its strip malls and cookie cutter homes and all that. But hidden in all that suburban community, if you look at the history of Newhall and Saugus and Castaic, this was the Wild West. And this story is really one of the quintessential stories of how this was the Wild West. I'm Alan Pollack. I'm president of the Santa Clarita Valley Historical Society. Let's get started. So William Wirt Jenkins was a pioneer of the Santa Clarita Valley, and he led a rather notorious and colorful life which was straight out of the pages of the Wild West. He grew up in Ohio with his brother, and he arrived in California goldfields with his family in 1851. There on the American River, Jenkins became skillful with a pistol when he had to hold off claim jumpers to cite claims that they were working on. So 2 years later, Jenkins drifts to the rough and tumble Pueblo of Los Angeles. This was not the city of the angels in the 1850s. It was one of the most violent towns in America at that time. Shortly thereafter, Jenkins' prowess with a pistol was gained the attention of Mayor Ignacio del Valle, and Jenkins was recruited into a semi-vigilante force called the Los Angeles Rangers. And this force was commissioned with cleaning up the mean streets of Los Angeles. A couple of the fellow rangers of Jenkins was Major Horace Bell. He had been a newspaper man and who later recounted his escapades in the book Reminiscences of a Ranger, which, by the way, was really the first book published in Los Angeles. And then his other compatriot in the Los Angeles Rangers was Cyrus Lyon, who with his brother Sanford emigrated out to California in the early 1850s from Macias, Maine. And eventually the two of them settled here in the Santa Clarita Valley and set up a stagecoach stop named Lyon Station, which we believe was in the vicinity of the Eternal Valley Cemetery up on Sierra Highway. And as you may know, Lyons Avenue is named after that. So this ragtag group of gunfighters embarked on a shoot first, ask questions later campaign, and they were said to have effectively cleaned up the mean streets of Los Angeles within about 2 years. Jenkins eventually migrates up to the Rancho San Francisco, which is the Santa Clarita Valley, and at that time the fledgling oil business was just taking off in adjacent Pico Canyon. And along with Sanford Lyon and Henry Clay Wiley, they sunk the first oil well in Pico Canyon in 1869 using the spring pole method of drilling. As a constable in 1873, Jenkins was reported to have escorted Tiburcio Vasquez gang member Abdon Leiva to turn him in at Lyon Station to Los Angeles authorities. Leiva had actually given himself up after finding the famous outlaw Vasquez in bed with his wife at a hideout near Lake Elizabeth. Vasquez was known for his lady-killing charms, and actually Abdon Leiva, when Vasquez was eventually captured, he actually testified against him in court, in trial. So in 1872, Jenkins made the fateful decision to lay claim to a large section of land along Castaic Creek, upon which he built the Lazy Z Ranch 6 years later. He married Olive Rhodes of Illinois, and he had 2 daughters. In the ensuing years, the Lazy Z Ranch became well known for breeding and training top-flight racehorses. Jenkins even trained horses for Lucky Baldwin of Santa Anita racetrack fame. And he also took horses belonging to Francis Pliny F. Temple, who was nicknamed El Templito of the Temple and Workman Bank. In 1893, Jenkins was involved with the Alcatraz Island, and actually Horace Bell in his newspaper, The Porcupine, had referred to Jenkins as the Baron of Alcatraz. Just to show you the men that were involved with the whole claim issue with Alcatraz, Governor Pio Pico granted to William Workman around 1850, and Workman eventually ceded ownership to Francis Temple, and Temple gave 1/2 interest to John Downey, who gave a 1/4 interest to Jenkins. And Jenkins became a joint owner of the island at that time with Downey, who quit claiming the land to Jenkins upon his death, and then there was a whole other thing that went on with that. And now we're going to talk about the Castaic Range War. So all is well at the Lazy Z Ranch until William C. Chormicle showed up in 1890. Chormicle was a crusty 50-year-old gentleman with a proclivity for guns similar to that of Jenkins. And he purchased 1,600 acres of land in the Castaic area, which had already been claimed by Jenkins for the Lazy Z Ranch. Chormicle himself had a large ranch out in Santa Paula, and that's where he spent most of his time. And he had his wife and several of his sons running the operations in Castaic. Now, the root of the dispute between Jenkins and Chormicle actually lay in an ambiguity in the law, which resulted in overlapping land grants in the Castaic area, which were given to two railroad companies. These Castaic lands were part of the body of more than 1 million acres in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, which were granted both the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad and the Southern Pacific Railroad. The lands were originally granted to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad by an act of Congress in 1866. And in 1871, the same general area was granted to the Southern Pacific Railroad, but it was supposed to specifically exclude the lands previously granted to the Atlantic and Pacific. But there was one problem. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was never completed. Thus, in July 1866, the land granted to the defunct Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was, by an act of Congress, forfeited. It reverted to the United States government and was restored to the public domain, which allowed it to be homesteaded. But in spite of the previous exclusions in 1871, the Southern Pacific Company continued to claim the lands that had reverted to the government. And it was in this setting that Chormicle appeared on the scene in 1890. Jenkins, unfortunate for him, had settled on land which ended up in the dispute between the government and the Southern Pacific Railroad. Chormicle claimed that same land based on what he called a permit from the Southern Pacific. So with Jenkins and Chormicle claiming the same land, the Castaic Range War, as we know it, officially began on February 28, 1890, when two men allied with Jenkins were shot dead by Chormicle and an accomplice as they were hauling lumber onto the disputed land to erect a cabin. 3 days earlier, a 25-year-old man by the name of George Walton had hauled some lumber to a section of land on which he was trying to file for a homestead. But that same section of land was claimed by Chormicle. So Walton passed by a shanty occupied by Chormicle, and Chormicle took exception to Walton's actions, and he had the lumber moved and thrown over a fence below the shanty. Walton and Chormicle proceeded to have an altercation, during which Walton struck Chormicle in the face. So then Walton decides to move the lumber back to his homestead location with the assistance of two Jenkins allies, Dolores Cook, seen here, and his brother-in-law, Jose Olme, seen here. I just put a dog scene there. This picture is a home of the Cordova family, which is a longtime pioneer family in the Castaic area. The photograph is about 1886, and just shows the two men that were involved with this Range War incident. Cook, as a matter of fact, was a Fernandino Indian of Tataviam, Pitanamuck, and Tonga descent, and Castaic was his ancestral territory. So back to the incident. They loaded a wagon with the lumber. They started off with Walton's wagon in the lead. Now, just as a disclaimer, these are not original pictures from the incident. We don't have that, so we just put up just to represent, to kind of give you a flavor for it. Olme accompanied Walton on the wagon, with Cook driving a horse and buggy behind them. And as the wagon passed by the shanty, Chormicle and his accomplice, William A. Gardner, appeared at the windows and opened fire with rifles and pistols. Walton was instantly killed. And Cook would go back to Jenkins' house, but died from his gunshot wounds 3 hours later. Olney was the only lucky one. He grabbed and ran alongside a horse. He shielded himself from the gunshots as he passed by the shanty, and he escaped to Jenkins' house unscathed, the only survivor of the shooting. And as soon as they were finished shooting, Chormicle and Gardner raced out of the shanty to a nearby canyon and fled into the canyon. About 1 week later, Sheriff W.H. Riley of Ventura County received word of where the men were and that they were ready to give themselves up. So Riley met up with the fugitives in Piru Canyon, and he brought them to Ventura. In late March 1890, Chormicle and Gardner stood trial for the murder of Walton and Cook. Their defense lawyers claimed the defendants were justified in the killing, alleging that Walton and Cook were the aggressors, and that Chormicle had to kill them in defense of his own property. The defense further attempted to show a conspiracy on the part of the men who lost their lives and Jenkins to kill Chormicle and Gardner. So they had an 18-day trial. It was one of the longest in county history to that time. Most trials lasted 1 day, so this was like an eternity for trials at that time. But the jury did just take 20 minutes to make a decision. And that decision was, both Chormicle and Gardner were found not guilty of the murder of Dolores Cook. And a second case for the murder of George Walton was also dismissed the next day. Now, I have spoken with descendants of Dolores Cook who are still here in the valley, and they still believe justice had been denied in this case. Well, the trial was over, but the Jenkins-Chormicle feud was just beginning. For the next 25 years, Jenkins-Chormicle and their henchmen picked up guns over every issue in the Castaic area involving roads, mining, grazing, and water. We believe that up to 20 or 21 people were said to have lost their lives over this period of time in the feud and rain war. Feud was thought to have ended in October 1904 when Chormicle was finally awarded the contested lands. And a patent issued by the United States Land Office awarded Chormicle the 1,600 acres that had been claimed previously by Jenkins. The Los Angeles Times quoted attorney J.L. Murphy, "The case has cost far more than the land was worth, but it was a fight for principle with the settlers that could not be given up once undertaken." And the violence continued in spite of the settlement. It was so bad that at one point President Theodore Roosevelt felt compelled to send newly appointed U.S. Forest Ranger Robert Emmett Clark to Castaic to attempt to intimidate the foreign factions to stop the fighting. And this did quiet things down, but Clark left in 1913, and again, after that, the war resumed. In fact, shortly after Clark left, Jenkins was shot in the chest at his ranch house by a Chormicle partisan, but he didn't survive that attack. And things came to a head on March 8, 1913, when Chormicle ally William Lewis Billy Rhodes shot Jenkins in a pistol duel in Castaic Canyon. As with the Chormicles, Jenkins had a running feud with the Rose family over disputed land. Rose had accused Jenkins of offering large sums of money to have him killed. And Jenkins said Rose never had any right to the land that he claimed, based on a grazing permit. And for this incident, Rose was brought to court on a charge of assault with intent to commit murder. This was a quote from Jenkins about when he testified in court, which is kind of interesting. He says, "I tried to get out my gun, but the pesky thing worked slow. I fired 2 shots and think I would have got Rose, but just then came another bullet which cut my arm." Now, ironically, neither of the 2 principals of the Castaic Range were killed in the battles. Both died of natural causes. Jenkins, and you can see his death certificate here, died quietly at age 81 on October 19, 1916 from a cerebral embolism. We previously thought that Chormicle was shot to death in 1916, an act for which Jenkins was suspected. It turns out that a recent review of his death certificate shows that he actually died from chronic kidney disease on March 25, 1919. And he's buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale. And finally, and ironically, neither Jenkins nor Chormicle died with their boots on.